bright, the light. Okay, thanks for having me. I think it's the second time around for Insomnihack. The last time was about 6-7 years ago, still at Mandiant at that time. And well, I'm really happy that I can talk a little bit about managing large-scale incident response, because in the last few years, I've seen a lot of people doing really great incident response from a technical perspective, but in the end, they still fail to an extent. The client is not super happy in the end, and mostly that goes down to errors in how you went through that whole engagement, because it's more than just knowing your technical stuff there. So first of all, what do I consider large-scale incident response? Before I introduce myself, I just say that first. I don't think that there is a clear definition, right? So for some, it's like a couple of hundred machines. For some, it's a couple of 100,000 machines. That does make a difference, obviously. Not necessarily from the technical perspective. That's the funny thing. That is just something that comes down to tooling. But if you have an organization with a couple of 100,000 machines, they just work a little bit more complex than an organization that has a couple of hundred machines. So it's more that human factor that you have in there. The only thing that I want to make clear is I'm not talking about a SOC ticket incident response, because, you know, most of the tools of those SOAR tools, they also call that kind of incident response when you work on a SOC ticket. That's not what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about a deep breach of a network where an attacker was active, moved laterally to a few machines, maybe exfiltrated some data. That's what I'm talking about here. So the term is a little bit overused here. It's very funny because from the sizing perspective, there is actually an analogy that we can use here. So when you go back to medical support in big accidents, a mass event is considered an event where the resources that are locally available are just too few to manage that response. And I think that works pretty well here as well. So it doesn't really depend on the size that you're facing, but rather on how you work there, what kind of people you have, how many resources you have, and so on. So how do I know that? So why do I think that I can talk about that? Well, first of all, how do I learn all that stuff? I make a ton of mistakes. Sometimes looks like this. And over the last decade or so, I don't make less mistakes probably, but they're just not as big as they used to be. And I also got lucky over the last few years because whenever I was about to make a bigger mistake, there was someone holding me back. That makes sure that I'm still in industry. But when you do incident response, you're always at the brink of losing your reputation pretty quickly, right? So if you do something wrong, if you declare an organization as super clean and they're not, then that's a problem. And that happens more and more. The second thing where I learned that is I'm teaching for SANS, actually the 5-weight Advanced Incident Response class. I'm authoring 2 more classes, one for memory forensics and one for enterprise incident response. And there we have on the 6th day always a capstone. So people are confronted with a made-up case, but that looks pretty real, right, to an extent. And they need to present that case. And the funny thing is you see the whole process. So they are going to be grouped in groups of 4 or 5 people, and they work on the data that they have. And in the end, they present what they have. And even groups that are doing technically great and found a lot of stuff don't win in the end. And the reason for that is sometimes they found something and then just forgot to put it into context and to put it on their slides and stuff like that. And that is something that happens in reality as well. And the most concerning thing of how I learn is actually, well, the easiest one for me, because learning from others' mistakes is usually something that's less painful for you. We're getting more and more called for a second opinion. So either there is an investigation going on, the client is not happy with the first vendor who went there. Secondly, we have expert witness cases where we write reports about investigations that happened in the past and where something didn't went that well and where the client sues the provider. So that happens more and more. And the first case when that happened in the US, I think was 2014, 2015, around that time in the US, had to do with a hotel and stuff, but I can't go into details on that case. Having said that, to my history, I've been doing incident response for over a decade now, teaching for SANS about a decade, and I've been doing that pretty much all around the world, except China maybe, because all the companies I worked for were not happy working in China that much. I used to work for German Telecom, for Mandiant. Now I'm working for a Swiss company, running an incident response and intelligence team. there, but in another part of Switzerland. And I got a question because I want to know who I talk to here. So who of you led incident response engagements in the past, no matter if internal or external? Oh, quite a few. That's cool. Never hesitate to correct me or tell me your view on things, right? That's how we all learn, right? How many of you or who of you had investigations over 1,000 hosts? Well, most of you that raised the hand before 10,000, 100,000. That's where it gets, well, a little bit more dicey because there are not so many companies that have that many machines out there. Who's working for a competitor? It was nice meeting you. Goodbye. Okay. So what we're going to walk through here is a few key success factors. Actually, I'm sort of stealing the part of those slides from myself. So they're coming out of the 608 class at Sense. Well, the information is going to be the same, so it doesn't make sense to have a complete separate set of slides. So those are the critical factors, because when I had the opportunity to build my own team, I could take whatever I learned before that and try to avoid the mistakes. But that also means that you kind of need to formalize what you learned in a way to make that like communicatable to someone else. And those are the key points. Visibility, we're going to go into detail pretty soon. Efficiency, technical skills, of course, documentation, and also soft skills. And the last part, or all of these parts in combination, are very hard to find. And usually it's either on the technical side or on the soft skill side, but finding the resources that can do both very well, that's a different story. That's really difficult, and it's giving us a hard time, and probably many of you have the same problem. So talking about visibility, that's a question I usually ask also tool vendors very often. I got like 4 questions here. If you're not a technical person, never mind. I'm going to explain a little bit what I'm asking for here and why I'm asking that. But with the tool set that you use, I think I put a size down here somewhere, 8,000 hosts, for example. So you're faced with an intrusion, 8,000 hosts. We're not talking ransomware here, right? So we're probably talking about someone who's interested in your IP or something, access broker, whatever. And the first question is, which machines have executables on their users' videos directory, at the same time get their timestamps and checksums for these executables? So could you do it? How long would it take you? So what do you think is an acceptable timing for that information, 8,000 hosts? Yeah, maximum. For the ones that are online, obviously, right? I mean, if you have to wait in international cases, you oftentimes have to wait, especially for clients to go online and stuff. But that's about it, minutes. We're talking minutes here. So whatever tooling you use, in a nutshell, if you have the right visibility, is just an extension of your brain, right? You ask questions and you get the answer. You just phrase them right. Give me all the creation timestamps of the profile folder of a specific user from all machines. Same thing pretty much, right? I think those 2 things that I just mentioned, especially the second one, you can do with pretty much any EDR. The first one I'm not totally sure about, because you need like a wildcard somewhere in the middle with the username. That makes it a little bit more difficult. The third one is a even more complex one. Find all machines that match a certain YARA rule in their memory. So that is what would make me ask a question when we're talking about memory. Are we talking about the memory as a whole, or are we talking about the process memory? That's a difference, right? So in other terms, if malware is in there and there's some residue somewhere in the memory, but it's not addressed anymore, well, then I will not find it if I just go for process memory. Now, the problem is many of the tools that are used out there, which is going for the process memory, right? And especially the most user-friendly tools, most user-friendly EDRs out there don't give you that opportunity at all to look into the memory that's not attached to a certain process. Recover the RDP bitmap cache from a specific user on all servers where the user logged in after a certain date. So you see, I keep combining more and more things, more and more factors into what I want to have. So first of all, what is the RDP bitmap cache? Just for not so technical people there. RDP, that's the remote desktop protocol. I guess most of you have used that before. And you probably realized when the internet connection is pretty slow, and you move your mouse right around the mouse, you see that the resolution of the screen is different than on the rest of the screen. And that's because this is the way how RDP updates your image. It updates in small squares. And it stores those squares in the RDP bitmap cache. So that means that you get like small parts of the screen of an RDP session from these. Now, when we know that a certain user account was used to log in or move laterally using RDP, we can get pieces out of that session. But I don't want to do that manually. So I need a way to make that collection automatic and get that on a number of machines. And also, when I have a first state where I believe that that user was used in a malicious way, that is another factor that I put in. So I don't want to have the information from the legitimate user. So visibility is important. And I think I usually try to visualize that using geography in a certain way, like length, for example, here. This is from a real case, 170,000 hosts that we did. And out of those, 105 turned out to be accessed by the attacker. Some with malware, some are just accessed with living off the land tools and so on. If we put that on a 100-meter racetrack, like Olympic racetrack, the whole machines, only 6 centimeters of that would have been infected by the user. Which, well, doesn't sound like a lot, especially because those 6 centimeters are not together, right? They're spread around the whole population. That means you need to look very closely at everything. Because if you miss one thing, they're going to be back. So we're talking there about nation states. There was a very funny case because they had 3 different groups in there, and they were battling each other to get that information first. And they never got rid of the attacker, by the way. They still have them in there, because it was impossible to completely remediate, at least of all of these. I think they later got rid of one of the attacker, but not because of what they did, but because of what another attacker group did. So that was very funny. We see that more and more, by the way, that attackers start to fix the initial holes, how they got in, right? So they start patching your machines. So if you don't do it, never mind, the attackers will do that for you. Question is if the price is right for that, but that's another story. If you look at the tool stack for that, what we're usually faced with is you have some sort of always on kind of thing. So that means all data gets stored in some sort of central repository, like a SIM or so. You can collect it using Sysmon, whatever. You get net flows from network devices or whatever. And you have the on-demand part. So EDRs are usually today, depending on the exact product, a mix of those two, right? So they store some data locally, but you can also actively demand data from the clients or servers if you want to. So they're somewhere in the middle. You can have enriched alerts with that. You can collect PCAPs. So PCAPs could be always on, but that's very rarely the case, right? Especially when it's about broad internet connections or connections at all. You have only very few organizations that really record PCAPs in a broad sense, unless you demand them to do that in a certain extent. And forensic agents. So what can you do if you're internal, for example, to get that whole thing better? So first of all, let's talk about threat hunting. So threat hunting, in a sense, is like living incident response. So the only difference in threat hunting is you don't know if the attacker is really in. But, well, what do you know in a real attack, right? Very often you find more attacker groups that you were aware of in the beginning. So that's not different. So you use the same techniques, you use the same tools. The highest form of threat hunting is hypothesis-based hunting. You set up a hypothesis. So for example, APT, I don't know, 28, could be very current, is in our network. So what do they usually do? What tools do they use? How would we identify them with our tool set? And what I depict here is not correct, right? I say you have that hypothesis and you could either accept it or you could reject it. But actually there's a third outcome, and that is the, well, sometimes even more valuable one, and that's the visibility is missing. Well, this is the hypothesis. This is how I would check, but I can't with our tool set. And that also tells you something, right? Because usually when the threat hunters in an organization cannot really hunt for a certain threat, your SOC can't detect it either. And that is not a good place to be, right? And that brings me to efficiency. You have to run through that a little bit. Obviously, you can't get full disk images for all machines when we're talking about a couple thousand machines. I'm not saying that there are not organizations out there who try, but they usually fail. I remember a case for a medium-sized company last year, beginning of last year. They have around 30,000 endpoints. And we were, again, the second ones they called in. So the whole thing started on Wednesday. They got another company in, and till Friday, they didn't do anything, because what they requested from the client was to set up a very beefy server, right? A lot of RAM, a lot of storage and so on. And they wanted to have the images of the patient zero, of the suspected patient zero delivered to that machine. And you know how it is in big organizations. You have like tons of outsourcing providers. It's just something that does not work easily, right? To get that data from A to B quickly. So they never established visibility there. And that's what we did in the end. When they would have looked at the machine, like maybe on Saturday, Sunday, whatever, when they would have gotten it, they would have realized that they would need to look at another 15 machines. So would they then request 15 other images? Or what is their approach to that? So it's just not going to work. So that could have hurt that organization very much. But in the end, every resource that you want to spend, and resources can be a lot, right? Like storage, but also human resources, needs to be justified by a question that you need to answer with that. I mean, that's in business, that's, I think, a very logical thing, right? Whatever you invest, you expect some return on that investment. And why not work the same here? So what we use in the different sense classes are actually those cones there. So basically, that funnel starts on top, right? So at the beginning, you look at a ton of machines, which basically allows you to use a set of techniques. Then if you go down that funnel, you select out certain machines where you use other techniques. If you basically translate that to a sort of resource pools, that's what we do. You basically have the same amount of resources. So that means you can look at very small data sets from many machines, or you look at bigger or complex things for a few machines, right? And the funny thing is, most cases begin somewhere in the middle, right? Some machine is acting up. It's still the case that very often in non-ransomware cases, capacity management is one of the first things that tell the organization that they have a breach. So it's not the AV, it's not their EDR, it's actually capacity management, right? So drive is running full because they're pulling together some data. Maybe a process is going high because the attackers don't know how to use the tool properly. So we had all of these, right? So for example, one case, they used a tool that's called Recharge, and that's basically a proxy into the network where the server side of the proxy can be whatever web file that is. So that could be an ASPX, that could be whatever, it could be any kind of Java file, and so on, could be PHP, and you just tunnel into the network. But the thing is, if you do that in Apache and you keep that session open for too long, it will peak out the CPU. So if you used that before as a pen tester and were called in that situation, you know that. But if you just use the tool, it works the same, right? Even if the CPU peaks, it works the same. But if someone monitors that server, they will realize that something is going on, and if they're careful, they will find that. So that's what I'm saying. So for example, small data sets, what could you do with that? Data stacking is one of the operations that we tend to use a lot. So for example, you can stack things like persistence, because malware does not only need to run, it also needs to keep running to a certain extent after reboot. So what you can do is you can get all the different locations how malware could persist itself, and then from there on stack that data, because obviously a Windows system looks pretty much like any other Windows system to an extent. So that means everything that's very unique will bubble up if you just count the occurrence count in the whole network. So in other terms, if you have like cmalware.exe, it's probably not on all 8,000 machines that we just discussed. It's maybe just on 10. So that means if you sort by the occurrence throughout the whole network, you will find that pretty easily. Technical skills. I guess it's pretty straightforward that we're talking about some sort of technical work here as well. So the investigators really need to understand their tools. And to be honest, that's one of the things where I see most failures happen, because people just overestimate their tools. One of the most common things is that they use IOCs, for example. Let's take OpenIOC as a format. OpenIOC allows you a ton of different parameters to specify, right? But that doesn't mean that every tool supports these. So what they do is they shoot certain IOCs at a tool, and if that comes back negative, they mean everything is clear. But maybe the tool just didn't check every part of that IOC because it was not capable of doing that. I'll just give you an example. For example, let's say you have an EDR that for some reason, that's a very made up example, but that for some reason only allows you to create MD5 checksums for files. Now your IOC includes a SHA-1 hash for the file, but not an MD5. So you shoot it at the network, it comes back negative because every file produces an empty SHA hash because it can't do that, and you think it's clean. And that is very dangerous, because the most dangerous thing for us as incident responders is false negatives, right? False positives are annoying. I'll give you that, right? But false negatives, that's what's going to break our necks, right? So if we think it's clean and it's not. TTPs of the attacker, they should know how attackers usually work. So in other terms, and that's something where I see some shortcomings with analysts who have never done pen testing. For example, you end up on a machine, like with one sort of your backdoor. Let's go back for Conti, they have the Bazaar loader there. Let's assume you're on that machine and you have a normal local user. So what are the steps that you could do to get a higher privileged accounts or higher privileged accounts? If you end up as a local administrator, what are the possible steps then? And so on. So if you have a normal user, what you could do, for example, would be Kerber roasting, right? That works with a normal user. If you have local admin, you could think about something like LSA dump, Mimikatz, whatever. And that is something that you have to understand from the attacker's side, because their options are limited based on what they have, what privileges they have at this point in time. Artifacts, all the different artifacts. So how can you prove a certain point? So what I always tell my people is the theory comes first, and then there comes the way to prove it. Because other than that, you have the risk of using the so-called golden hammer method. So if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, even though it isn't. And that is super dangerous in that regard. Enterprise architectures, they need to understand how normal enterprise architectures work and are set up. And then the most difficult thing sometimes is blueprint. So that's the ideal company, enterprise normal, which is usually a little bit more messed up. Then unusual, it's not necessarily bad. And then really malicious. So it's not like a clear differentiation between those. It's more like fluent in between those stages. Documentations. And the questions that I ask there is, when people say they document very well, is, did you ever write a report for a case that you didn't lead, that someone else led and you were not on the case? And you had to rely on their documentation. Did you ever do that? If not, you're doing well, because that means you manage your resources wisely. Unfortunately, I had to do that very often. And to be honest, it sucked every single time before we went up and came along with some sort of standard. Documentation is not just important for writing the report. That's one thing, right? But you also have to manage the stakeholders. I mean, if you're in there like an external entity and you already charged them like 200, 300 hours, but you need 100 more, I need good grounds to discuss that with the client, right? So that is also one thing that is important. The police might ask me something. Then it's important for resource planning. I don't want to have too many people on the bench. I mean, having the worst thing as an external entity is when you have people on the bench and at the same time you turn down engagements, right? So that shouldn't happen, because that's a really bad resource management there. Intelligence development. So for us, I'll show you that later. It's technically possible when we record something during an incident, you put it into our documentation and we can put it on a feed pretty quickly, like within hours, right? David, about hours or within the hour, depending on how much coffee you had, right? Okay. Remediation. I need to have a clear understanding what I need to clean up, because rebuilding is not always an option. That means I need to clear out as much as I can, but that means also that I have to come up with a plan, because in remediation I also have limited amounts of resources. Liability prevention. So if it's coming back to me, well, someone else shouldn't be able to really disassemble what I did in a way that they say they did stupid things, they missed this one, they missed that one. I should have recorded everything. Also, all the things that the client told you. So when the client tells you, no, I don't want you to do this, you're not supposed to go to this machine, we're not going to install your agent there, then that's something I need to record, right? Because later on, that's how I can prevent liability there. A general rule of thumb there is, if you don't document it, it didn't happen, right? So obviously we also don't manage to get it right every single time, but yeah. Soft skills. So the most important one is right at the end. Pizza orders and coffee machine. Operating coffee machine is very important. That was difficult during COVID. I'll give you that. No, but really stakeholder management. That's very important. Keeping the client happy. It usually doesn't work very well, no matter how good you are. If you just say, okay, we roll out our agents, then you go silent for 2 weeks and then you come back. They will call you. They will not be happy. They want to be entertained, right? To a certain part at least. You're going to lose a resource on that. That's for sure, because those people who entertain the board are usually not able to work anymore on the case, really. But yeah, that's just how it works in big organizations. You have to manage the IR team. I mean, it's different for the client. Usually it's the first time or maybe second time. They don't do that every day, but it's not that thrilling for your investigators anymore. If it's too thrilling for investigators, you probably have an unexperienced team. So they don't care if that case is super thrilling for the organization. They want to go on vacation the next week, right? So you have to plan around that. They do that every day. So that is important to understand. Regular IT teams, I mean, they could be in a very bad position depending on your client. Sometimes they get pressured because someone says they basically put the organization at risk, which most of the times is not necessarily true, at least not alone. So you have to take care of these people as well. Then they might have SOCs that work with you. Sometimes they have them internally, sometimes they have an external outsourcing provider. They are also concerned about their liability, so they probably won't give you everything that you need, and not in a way that you want to have it. So that's also very difficult. The breached entities clients, you would wonder how often I have to talk to partners, clients, and so on of our breached entities, because they don't trust the entity themselves anymore, but they oftentimes trust us because sometimes they are our clients already and they know how we work. It's often about like reopening VPN tunnels and all that stuff to the breached organization. So how could you set up a team to make all that work from a human resource perspective? So usually we have one IR lead who leads a case. For smaller cases, the lead is the only person you'll get, and sometimes even that only for 50%, depending on how it works out, right? Bigger cases, you might get more analysts, but they can pop in and pop out. I don't have like people assigned 100% to a case. That makes it a little bit more difficult. Then we have cross-function like malware reversing. They don't care. They don't need to be attached to a single case, right? They just work on malware. Intel analysts, they need to be aware of any case and give you the information that they saw something that they also saw in another case before. Roles and duties. So you have the IR lead who basically manages the engagement. Sometimes they also, do some sort of an analyst role, depending on the case size again. I mean, if I have an engagement with 2,000 machines, I don't really need a second analyst for that, right? That is what one person can normally do alone, depending on what exactly happened. You have analysts there that work on that case. They do the actual triage, they do the hunting and so on. On the shared functions, you have the malware analysts, so they get malware to analyze. They tell you things about, for example, callbacks, right? Because if they find an IP address, a host name, whatever, you can go back and figure out what other machines are connected to that C2 server based on firewall logs or whatever you have. Intelligence analysts, first of all, for us, cater for our feed, and secondly, they sort of interconnect investigations. So as soon as you get bigger, it's difficult to have all analysts watch all the chat channels for the different engagements. And if that happens, we need someone to be in control and make the connection if something is similar in two different cases. External entities, that's super important to manage them. You have so many different entities like law enforcement, for example. They can do things that we can't do. Not necessarily because they're technically better, but they have some legal means that they can use, like freezing servers. I mean, in Europe, they cannot give you the server right away, but at least they can make sure that the provider doesn't change it anymore, right? So they keep the server until you can legally get an image from them, until that's sorted out. So things like that can be very useful. Law firms, that's especially difficult sometimes in big international companies. In the US, it goes as far as that legally would have the obligation in some communities to even report a breach to the mayor of that city. It even goes down to, no one does that, right? But technically you would be obliged. So they have very different reporting obligations there. Communication firms, it's all about communication. Remember, there was a breach in 2014, I believe, at a British telecommunications provider. The CEO went out and she said, yeah, we had a breach, but we didn't lose data. The next day she came back, well, we might have lost like 7,000 customer data sets. Next day she came back, well, maybe it was rather 60,000 or something. And they kept finding new data until 2019. That's when the BBC got back and found additional data. She was there for another half year. The organization was losing about 300 million in value. So it was not a super good communications example here. The important thing is communicate with one voice, right? Either it's really one entity that communicates, but if multiple entities communicate, then do that with one voice. Going back to resource management real quick, we have different types of resources. So Julius Caesar, divide et impera, so divide and conquer. It's meant differently, by the way. So he meant that differently than we do, but it's still very useful for us. So we have the human resources like analysts and so on. We have storage, CPU, for searching and stuff. And we have tools, process, and content. With content, I mean IOCs and all that kind of stuff. And only the middle one can be procured very easily. I mean, I can spin up as many machines with as many RAM I want at Amazon, at Azure, whatever I want, right? That's easy. But on the analyst side, you got what you got. And on the tooling side, I mean, I can buy a tool pretty quickly, but that doesn't mean I can integrate it into my workflow that quickly. So that is what I mean there. So good resource management in a nutshell means bringing resources and tasks together with the minimum overlap, right? So on the other hand, if that is the resources and that is the tasks, the ideal match would be something like this. If you do it like this, you are missing a lot of tasks, you're not doing them, and you are wasting resources. So that's the general idea behind that. And the key is standardization, because only if everyone knows in the teams what someone else is talking about, only then you can basically succeed there. And for that, you can predefine tasks like, okay, what is a sweep and hunt? So I'm hunting for user assist, for example. So I create a stack out of all user assist keys. So user assist stores execution of GUI tools, right? For example. So this is something you could also hunt for. Triage, that's another set. And those sets always come with a timing involved, right? So what kind of skill sets do you need? What resource can you put on that? And how long can that resource take for that? And then you can, in the end, come up with something like this. So for example, analyst 1 is working on a triage, 2 triages. We usually take around 4 or 5 hours for that to really be sure about what happened on a single machine. So that's about the maximum for that. So that analyst will be blocked if you talk about an 8 to 10 hour day. Another analyst has a persistence stack, an execution stack, and triage. So also occupied the whole day. Then we have an analyst 3 who probably worked in a different case. So we assign like 2 hours, 3 hours to familiarize himself with the case. And after then, 1 triage, and there's still some leftover from the other case. And when you schedule people like this, you avoid too big overlaps, right? And it's not that we don't want to pay for more people, we just don't get them. And that means we need to manage them wisely. And I think most of you are in the same situation. I would wonder if not. So if you're not in that situation, then please let me know how you do that. I would be really thrilled to know. So never do anything without a guiding question, right? So everything you do should guide a question, because no question, you can dive down into a forensic images for days, weeks, and months and still find new things. But does it help the case? Mostly not, right? So that is, you have to differentiate research that you can put on your blog from things that you do for your client or your organization. That's very important there. So questions could be, what did the attacker do on system XYZ? Which other machines have the attacker staging directory? So for example, if they use program data, whatever, then you can look for all the machines. What data was staged for exfiltration on host XYZ? Things like that. So in general, you first formulate a question. It's not that formal, right? In reality, it's, hey, analyst XYZ, can you really quick check this and that in the chat, right? All the other stuff is implicit, right? So they know what I'm talking about because they are usually technically skilled. They understand my question because I, asked them. They know what way to use to figure that out, usually. I already have the right analysts, and they do that and they give me the result. So it's not that formal. So I just try to sort of formalize that in some sort of way. That brings me to the last points there, documentation. And there are some principles that we try to follow there. And again, documentation, especially in high pressure environments, is difficult. But on the other hand, especially in high pressure environments, you should document very well. So as soon as you have breaches in big organizations, it's always a political game. So what you can't do and what will make you fail is, and that is what almost made me fail when I was a very young analyst in that regard. It was an organization with around 200,000 hosts, and I was fortunately not leading that. There were so many political games going on, and I didn't understand them at this point, because I always thought, okay, everyone is pulling on the same rope, going into the same direction, and working for the best of the client in the client's organization. That's not true. In reality, it was a lot of infighting. They used that whole incident to kick others out of their position and take their position and so on. And that is something you don't want to be drawn in too much as an organization. You have to separate yourself from that and be aware of that and control the situation. So what I try to do, and that is something we really do, good IR leads can brief their staff, but also the clients and also all other stakeholders at every given time. Even if, and that happens to me, I have clients that just want to talk to me like some sort of escalation or something. I can call up our so-called spreadsheet of doom. I'll get to that. And I can brief them even if I have no clue about the case. If the analysts document it right. That is the idea. At every given point in time, that should be possible. So usually, especially in large cases, documenting takes time, that's for sure, but it saves more time than it takes in the end. That is also something. And don't get me wrong, I hate documenting. I really love hunting, I hate documenting. But I hate it even more when I get confronted with a badly documented case and I can't say anything about it, because then it's usually embarrassing and I try to avoid that. So as soon as documentation is confirmed, information is confirmed, documented. I'm not saying that we, for example, always put it into the documentation software right away, but at least we have it in a chat and we mark it that it has to be added, right? Because sometimes when you're on a call, information keeps coming in and you want to think about it a little bit before you document it, right? But then you still need to make sure that it ends up in the documentation in the end. So Spreadsheet of Doom is actually a name that came from Mandiant. We had it in Sense as well. That's why I can even name that. I think it was 2015 as well when Mandiant changed that name. The reason for that is we always sent a redacted version to the client for the weekly status meetings. And it always said SOD and then the case number. It was done in Excel. And unfortunately, one client cared to ask, what does SOD stand for? And we said Spreadsheet of Doom, and they didn't find it funny. That is the reason why they changed it to Engagement Management Sheet. But I'm happy to keep that name there. Okay, so the idea is it's the single place of truth about the investigation. So I'm not saying store the actual malware in there, but at least references to it. So it contains a master timeline that tells you the whole story about the case. And that is also what I see in those day 6 challenges at SANS. Usually, the groups that fare best are the ones that tell a story rather than answering single questions. I mean, I just said answer questions and so on, right? But not in the presentation, not in how you basically then present the case. Tell a story. They came in via this vulnerability on that server. Shortly after that, they pivoted to somewhere else. Then there was nothing, which makes us believe that maybe that was an access broker who later sold the access off to someone else. That's how we explain the gap of 1 month in between the first breach and you know how it works, right? Those of you who do that know what I'm talking about. Also, it's a good way for resource management, because if you have like machines piling up for triage, for a closer inspection, I need to know how fast I can work through that. So if I have 2 people, I know one person can do true triages a day, and I have like 8 machines piling up. I either invest the next 4 days doing that, or I need to get more analysts, whatever works best in the setting of the case, right? And that is important to know, because it also is basically influences prioritization. Because if I know that it will take 4 days, I need to think about what do I need first. That's important. Okay. So there's a basic rule for us. If it's too big, then it doesn't go into the SOT, but it will be referenced. So, for example, like large PowerShell payloads, I don't put them in the SOT directly. I reference them by number, put it in a wiki or whatever you fancy for that. Because for me, when I tell the story, I don't need to have the full PowerShell. I know this is the PowerShell implant, Cobalt Strike implant, or whatever, right? So the problem that I was faced with is at Mandiant, we tried to create a tool to make that. Now, you have a ton of very experienced incident responders, and no one works the exact same way as the other one. So that means that they tried to come up with a specification to have that software written, but they failed for years because too many big egos and so on. So it didn't work out. They kept working on Excel and sharing that via, what is the predecessor of Git? So yes, right, CVN, right? Yeah, because there you could lock the files to indicate that no one else can overwrite. It's super annoying, but it works in the end. But the problem is that works with experienced teams. In the end, you end up with like 20 different versions of the SOT. One has more columns, one has less columns, one who knows how to use pivot tables, uses pivot tables and all that kind of thing, right? And it did the job, that's for sure, but it is not suitable for not so experienced teams, right? And it's particularly hard, and I know that because I came to an organization who had that already, for someone new to get into that tune. That's super difficult. So now when I had the chance like 5 years ago to build my own team, I said, okay, I need to do that differently. Because if you give unexperienced people too much freedom in documentation, you end up in a mess. That's for sure. So I came up with the first version of Aurora IR. That's what it looks like. And I sort of have to excuse myself to a little bit here. The biggest problem with that, it's not super handy when it comes to being used by multiple analysts. So the idea, it's basically pretty much the thought that we had at Mandiant, plus a few things, particularly interconnections, visualizations, and so on. I'll get to that in a moment. But it's a flat file. It's a flat file that you work on with the tool. The reason for that, why I started out, and that's also one of the reasons why they kept to Excel, is I still had in the back of my mind cases where I was sitting, for example, in some bunker in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. You did not have internet, you had nothing. We literally had to leave the machines there. So they just paid for the machines. We had new machines, we left them there. When we wanted to check IOCs, like MD5 sums and so on that we found, we had to literally print them out. We had a printer there in that bunker. We had to print them out, bring them with us to the hotel, OCR them, which not always worked very great. OCR them back and check it against our data sets on other machines. And in those settings, having something at Azure or somewhere else does not work very well. And that is why I came up with that. Second reason is I do, before COVID, and now it's starting, and I flew around quite a lot. So when you want to write a report, you shouldn't be relying too much on the internet to write that, because then you lose the time in the airplane. That's another reason for that. That's why it's monolithic. You can use it with multiple analysts, or you could, with just putting data on a share. So super easy that way. No, it's not, but it works. Forget about that. Will be a new version out pretty soon. One of the good things is you get visual timelines. And one important thing in incident response is those false negatives, things that you miss, right? Those are the dangerous things. So if a timeline is inconsistent, if there's an indication that you missed something, you should see that graphically. You should visually see that. I'll give an example. We saw exfiltration to Mega with rclone or something. No, Megasync. And it ended like 7-8 hours before encryption in the ransomware case. Sorry. Need some water. And the thing about that is we couldn't make sense of that. Did they go on vacation or what was going on there? And the thing was, we then realized, because we saw that they recovered that machine from a backup that was exactly 7 hours older. That was the reason. So they got a little bit newer snapshot, which gave us a little bit more logs about the exfiltration. But we would have missed that without the graphical representation, because if it's in a flat table, every distance between two lines looks the same, right? That is super dangerous. And you also get an idea about the lateral movement. And here we're looking for islands. So if you see lateral movement between machine A and B, and you have a big cluster like that, then the question is, how is A and B connected with the rest of the cluster? You must be missing something. That is also important. And then we hooked it up to other tools, like VirusTotal or MISP, so we can shoot every indicator right into MISP, so it goes on the feed, right in investigation. This is going to be the new version. I'll just show you real quick. At least I tried to. It's not out yet because there's something in the Ukraine that came in the way a little bit. That is Mirror. This is, oh, great. Let me just see. Look, I had to Google how to mirror the displays on the new macOS. This is what it looks like. It's a little bit different. It's a web application, as you can see. It will work on a graph database, so there's Neo4j in the background of that whole thing. And the idea is the same, right? So you have like the master timeline is the thing you talk about, but on the other hand, if you're new to a case, you get some information already, right? You start into a case. We start a case with a questionnaire. So depending on what kind of case that is, we ask different questions, right? We also ask non-technical questions like, are you publicly traded? Because then we want to know in which stock exchange. If it's in New York, we know we're going to have to deal with the SEC, and that's not fun, right? So that is just what I'm talking about. You get an indication. So that would be a typical case where you have an access broker, right? So you see like on the left-hand side some activity, and then on the right again, and in between nothing. So either you're really missing a lot, or it was an access broker. You see how long they have been breached, so quite long. And the other thing is it helps you throughout the process. So as I said, you can look through the timeline like this, but you also have the visual timeline where you can later see gaps. So you see exactly what happened. Let's walk through it real quick. So we had a web shell, Outlook vulnerability. We had tons of these. The attacker put in recharge. With the recharge, they RDP'd to localhost. That works pretty well. With the admin user that they got right off the web server, they installed something kill AV, but then they ran Mimikatz under the name X64, which is quite frequent. We got that installation because that's when the file got there. We also got the execution here because they double-clicked it on the desktop. Then they pivoted to the domain controller. They started Cobalt Strike there, and on that server, we see in the shellbacks that they were looking for a file server or a server called F1 and the finance share there. That is as far as it goes. We can look at it from the lateral movement perspective if we want to. It's not super complex. It's an easy case, right? I just made that up out of real data, but it's not a real case. And also it will help you in the future, and that's very new in cleaning up. So for example, it's a graph database, right? So everything can be connected with everything. So in other terms, before that, we had that timeline, and we had that malware stuff, and we had to go through the malware tab and filter for hosts to make a cleanup plan for a specific host. Now you just need to go, like, for example, this is the Exchange server, go there and say, okay, what kind of malware do we have on this server? Okay, those 3 things. Get rid of these. Then we should be good to go. What is the specific timeline for this machine? Only for this machine. And all of the things can be, presented in any given way, which gives me a little bit more flexibility to work on your suggestions. Before that, it was very difficult in the old version because of the data model. Now, everything is possible because we are talking about a network here. And it's, in the end, all about the presentation, and that can be changed quickly. The underlying data model, that's a different story. But presentation, that's usually just a matter of time, nothing else. And, this is the idea there. Any questions? Oh, it will be open sourced again. The problem with that is I just do that once it's far enough that pull requests will not kill me. That is the idea.
Thank you, Mathias.
Thank you.
Are there any questions in the room?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just have one question related to resource management. So as you mentioned very wisely, so the case is a very important and exciting event for the customer, but it is less for the team who does that every day. So how do you manage resource management in the face that the customer expects people to work on the case every time, all night, and people just have lives on the side of that?
The funny thing about that is that my perception, especially in Switzerland, is very different than when working in other countries. So in Switzerland, I made the experience that clients are very relaxed and reasonable. That's not always the case in incident response. And there it works. And otherwise, the client will not be watching you work. What the client sees is progress. So what you need to make sure is that whenever the client expects progress, they get to see progress, no matter when it was made. And that could also mean if it doesn't, the major thing is never hurt the client. But if the client got crazy, that also will hurt the client. So in a nutshell, it also might mean dosing information, right? So instead of just throwing everything at a client, sometimes it helps the case to dose the information wisely. Give the right information at the right time, not basically overflat the client. That is what helps there.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, Mathias. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Was awesome talk. I have 2 quick questions, hopefully. First is, it's interesting hearing your experience building a team and getting that all set up and sorted. We're in like similar situations typically, and we're finding it's a bit of a, especially if you're dealing with a lot of legacy baggage and way things were done, especially with tooling. We're finding like there's an over tooling in some ways where you have so many tools and so many ways, people need to know how to use them and they overlap in a lot of ways. Like, how do you avoid going down that rabbit hole of over tooling and over complicating things essentially?
First of all, congratulations to building your own team. That's a lot of fun. sometimes. Secondly, overtooling. My usual quote on that thing is, a fool with a tool is still a fool. And that is what we see very much. And I would like to respond with the question-based approach. So if the tool answers specific questions, well, then it has its legitimacy, right? In that case. If it doesn't, or it's like also covered by 3 other tools, then you have to make your selection. But I like the question, because there's one thing that I didn't say about that. Because obviously, and I think you know that, oftentimes you get asked by the client, hey, we bought that super expensive tool, why don't you use that? And some organizations do, and the problem with that is then they're not as efficient, because how could you, right? You're used to a certain approach, and you're only efficient if you use that. And that is some advice that I might give you, and that is something I said to our CEO when I started that. I said, you have to be prepared to turn down cases, because if we want to be successful, we do it our way. If we have to do it in another way, we're just one like the others, right? And that means that if they don't want it that way, then, well, try someone else and come back later when they fail. That's what we did very often, and they kept coming back. Trust me.
Great, cool, thanks. And second question is relating to the point you made about where companies more and more are looking at the legal stuff, and like they're looking more and more when an incident happens. It's very stressful. Obviously, in some cases, kind of look for a scapegoat, for example. So you come in, and the risk for us as supporting, we want to support them. But if things don't quite go so smoothly or well, they're looking for someone to blame, essentially. Like, how do we reduce that risk of where we are blamed, where ultimately we're just trying to help and support them, right? And how do we reduce our risk exposure from that?
Well, one of the things is you shouldn't deviate too much from the industry standard. That is one thing, because that's what you're going to be measured. So whenever, for example, I write an expert witness report for court or something for damage things, then my reference is always the industry standard at the time, the knowledge at that time. I can compare. I just recently wrote something for an incident that happened in 2019. So the organization got on site. They charged like 10,000 a day for one person, which is quite a lot. They got on site. They investigated until Friday. On Friday, they said, you're clean now. On Sunday, they were fully encrypted. And so we're looking at day one, right? Knowledge of 2019. They knew, because they had it in their daily report, that at this day, they had Emotet on one of the domain controllers. 2019, remember, Sodino Kiwi, Emotet, TrickBot, all that stuff was on that time. And I found from that vendor, I found a blog article, no, actually it was a webcast, like 2 or 3 weeks prior to that event, where they said exactly, Emotet, that's all, nowadays it's always related to those ransomware attacks, right? So that means they didn't act after what they said themselves, right? And that's the ideal thing, right? So you have to basically just align to the industry standard. Then they can still blame you, but they cannot hurt you too much. Because you can always say that this was normal back then.
So we are a bit limited for more questions, so I invite you to come directly to Mathias if you have any more questions. Thank you, Mathias.
Thank you.